Theodore. He's a tugboat and a friendly tugboat too. A friendly tugboat too. Oh, Theodore likes to do the things that friendly tugboats do.
Oh, hello. I was just wondering, well, when people put gas or oil in their boats or cars, so they can move around, do they ever stop to think about where the gas or the oil comes from? Huh? You know that some of it comes from way down under the ocean? Yeah. Here, I'll show you. Come with me. See, if you were to go straight out here, right out the harbor for miles and miles, you'd bump into these big things called oil rigs. Oh, very important job. The only thing is, the oil rigs know it. See, every now and then, they start to think that they're just a little more important than the other boats and ships. Oh, we had an oil rig named Tex in here for repairs a while ago. Well, that big fella got into trouble here in the harbor. And it wasn't that long ago. The giant oil rig had arrived in the middle of the night, back from a job way out on the ocean. Theodore didn't know much about oil rigs, and he found them a little frightening. They were so big, so tall, so completely different from any vessels he'd ever seen here in the big harbor. But George laughed and told him not to worry.
Those rigs are big, all right, he said. But don't worry. I know them well. They all ask for me when they come in here. George, I want you to move that oil rig closer to the shore, announced the dispatcher.
George looked at Theodore as if to say, I told you so.
And take Theodore along with you,
finished the dispatcher. Right away, Theodore began to worry. That oil rig looked awfully big, and George could be touchy about towing George's way. He was worried he'd make a mistake and then George would lose his temper. Maybe a bigger tug would be better, he said, trying to use his most helpful voice.
Follow me, Theodore, said George. I'll show you everything you need to know about oil rigs. Just don't get in the way.
As they got closer to the giant oil rig, George was chuckling away.
Oh, yes, they always ask for me. That's because I'm so big and strong. We'll be swapping stories with this big fella in no time, continued George. Just you watch, Theodore. Morning, Tex.
The big oil rig only stared a mighty stare down at the two tugs.
Tex, we're going to move you to a better spot in the harbor. Now, what do you want?
Tex drawled. He had a deep, slow voice that didn't sound very friendly at all. It made Theodore even more uncomfortable than before.
Don't need no little tugs to move me, said Tex. I can do that just fine myself.
Then he started up his engines. Well, George was silent. Theodore didn't know what to say either. This wasn't what he had expected at all. Finally, George spoke quietly.
Well, we'll stand by then. You can go home for all I care, said Tex. Silly little puffers. You're only in the way anyways.
Theodore wondered what he should do next. The giant rig was being very rude to George. Theodore didn't know if George was angry or sad.
Look out of the way,
snarled Tex, starting to move. Well, Theodore couldn't think about George anymore. He had to move fast before the big oil rig ran right into him. Now, as soon as George and Theodore were back at their dock, Foduck was eager to find out what it was like to work with the oil rig.
Did he tell you lots of stories about the ocean?
Asked Foduck.
He was pretty tired, said George. Well, we figured we'd better let him get some rest. He wanted us to stay, but...
Theodore stared at George. Why, that wasn't true at all.
I guess George gave you a good lesson about moving oil rigs, eh, Theodore? Said Foduck.
Theodore didn't know what to say. After all, he never wanted to tell a lie, but if he told Foduck about how badly the oil rig had treated George, George was likely to get upset again. Said Theodore, well, I've certainly never met anyone like him before. That was true enough, thought Theodore sadly.
I've just been told a storm is coming, the dispatcher announced. George, make sure the Texas anchor cables are firmly in place.
Theodore was towing Bobby Barge to his dock before the storm when he saw George idling near the oil rig. While he watched, George cleared his throat and said,
There's a big storm coming. Do you need any help with your anchors? Oh, you again? Said Tex, cutting off George. Why don't you just run along now? I don't need your help. I got more important things to do than chatter with every little tub who just floats on by. Tub? Cried George. I'm the strongest tugboat in the big harbor. When you go for your fill of oil, where do you think it comes from, huh? Comes from big fellas like me that stay out at sea all alone for months at a time in all kinds of weather. So I don't need some little tug and tow truck's help in this little old harbor now.
well, George felt terrible. Ships and oil rigs were always happy to have him help them. Not Tex. And you know something? For a moment, George wondered if Tex was right. Maybe he wasn't a useful tugboat after all. It looks like that oil rig is still being mean to George, Bobby, said Theodore. As usual, Bobby didn't say anything. Barges are so nice and quiet, thought Theodore.
We must be sure all the ships in the harbor are safely tied up before the storm, the dispatcher was saying.
What's wrong with George? Whispered Hank to Fodak. He had noticed that George seemed very sad, floating off by himself. I don't know, said Fodak, glancing at the gathering clouds. He just got back from telling that big oil rig about the storm.
That oil rig is only a bundle of rods and rails, said Theodore.
Fodak was surprised with how upset Theodore seemed to be about the oil rig.
Tugboats always do what's best for any ships on the water, Theodore, said Fodak. No matter what kind they are.
Theodore sighed. He hoped the big oil rig would soon go back out to sea again. It's going to be a big storm, said Emily, shivering. You can feel it in the wind. Theodore had been told to check again that all the barges were safe at their docks before the storm arrived. On his way back, Theodore had to pass close to Tex. He noticed that one of Tex's big anchor cables was worn and weak. If it had broken the storm, Tex might be hurt or even smash into other ships in the harbor. Theodore remembered the way Tex had treated George, and he really didn't want to talk to the big rig. But then Theodore remembered what Fodak had said. Tugboats always do what's best for any ships, no matter what.
Tex, you've got a worn anchor cable, and we're gonna have a storm. Do you think it'll be okay? Listen, little puffer, replied Tex. I rode out hurricanes on a wide open ocean on these here anchor cables. I bet you never even been out on ocean.
Oh, no, I haven't, sir, admitted Theodore.
Well, you just mind your own business then, drawled Tex.
Well, Theodore didn't like being spoken to that way. He was so upset, he just turned and headed for home. The wind was getting stronger and stronger. George was by himself when Theodore returned to the Great Ocean dock.
I saw you talking to Tex out there, said George, still grumpy. Oh, I suppose he's your friend now.
Well, that made Theodore sad. I mean, he'd only been trying to help, and now George seemed to be nasty to him.
We have an emergency, announced the dispatcher. One of the anchor cables on the oil rig's cable has broken, and he's in danger. He might even drift out of control. George, you must put a line on the rig, he continued. Leave immediately.
What would George do, wondered Theodore. Tex had been so rude to George.
Well, on my way,
Called George, gunning his engines.
Do something and fast,
Cried Tex.
Hang on tight,
Yelled George, hoping Tex could hear him through all the wind. But before George could start to pull, the wind twisted Tex around. With all the wind and waves, another one of Tex's anchor cables broke with a loud snap. "Help!" called George. "Help! Theodore! Help!" Theodore couldn't believe it. He thought George was angry with him, but now George was asking for his help. He went as fast as he could. Off in the distance, Benjamin Bridge loomed over the water. "Quick!" yelled Tex. He was headed right for Benjamin. Of course, Benjamin couldn't move out of the way. If Tex wasn't stopped, there would be a terrible crash. Tex and George were swirling in the storm, getting closer and closer to Benjamin. Benjamin was getting scared. "Turn back! Turn back!" he yelled. Theodore quickly saw what he had to do. "Oh no!" cried Tex. "I'm gonna crash!" Theodore had his lines around the big legs of the rig in a flash. And then he went right underneath Tex. Well, a bigger tugboat wouldn't have fit under there. But Theodore is so small and fast and nimble, he pulled as hard as he had ever pulled before, trying to stop Tex from twirling around. Theodore could almost feel Benjamin behind him. "Pull, little guy!" cried Tex. "Hurry!" cried Benjamin. Theodore was pulling so hard, it was beginning to hurt. It was working. Tex had stopped moving. Now George could pull Tex in a straight line with all his might. George let out 3 mighty blasts of his horn, and 3 again. "Good tugging, Theodore!" he yelled. Theodore gave 3 happy toots in return. "Well done, George," he said. And Benjamin Bridge was pretty happy too. After they got back to Tex's place in the harbor, the storm was almost over, and both tugs felt great. "Thanks, Theodore," said George, still tired from all his work. "I'd have been really stuck without you." He took a couple more deep breaths. "You know, Theodore, you look small, but you're really as brave as the biggest of us." "And thanks a bunch from up here," said Tex. "Maybe sometimes I am a little too big for these here bumpers," continued the big rig. "And now I know I'd have been just a bunch of rods and rails without both of you." "You know, you're both big fellas to me," said Tex. "This all reminds me of a little old story I heard one time down in the Gulf of Mexico." Tex found out that even big fellas like himself needed a little help from our tugboats from time to time. We could have told him that, huh? Well, he had lots of great stories, and the tugboats and he became real good friends. You know, I thought I heard a little squeak over here in this door hinge a while ago. I gotta put a little oil on it. There. That's it. Well, thanks for visiting us here in the big harbor, and we'll see you all again next time. Bye-bye.
There's another story coming right up, and you can always learn more about Theodore Tugboat on the internet. Find us through PBS Online.